Thank you. For almost 8 years, I worked in an industrial part of town near the Durango Curve off I-17 in Phoenix. That's where the Arizona Department of Transportation's Traffic Operations Center is located. And since that was a mouthful and the government loves a good acronym, we'll call it ADOT's TOC. A good chunk of that time was spent working overnights from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. Often I would get there early and just keep driving around until my shift started. Inevitably, I would always find myself driving past the Maricopa County Jail Complex, specifically the newer, sprawling Watkins Jail. Chills went down my spine every time I drove past. Anxious thoughts of, that could be me. I could be there and not here in my car. Any mistake, any wrong choice, wrong place, wrong time. I could be there in that drafty facility stripped of my rights and frankly scared, guilty, gutted, empty. But as I drove on, a different kind of guilt would set in. The burden of freedom. Fortunate that I could simply go on with my life, yet a weird feeling of not quite deserving it. There but for fortune go you or I. The song we just performed for you was written in 1963 by a folk singer named Phil Oakes. At the time, Phil was toiling away at coffee shops in Greenwich Village like Cafe Wha, along with other folkies inspired by the burgeoning social upheaval of the decade. There was lots to protest in the 1960s, and Oakes made a name for himself as a protest singer, though he preferred the title of topical singer. His songs' topics would typically be ripped from the headlines: civil rights, labor struggles, the U.S.'s involvement in Vietnam. In fact, his first album was called All the News That's Fit to Sing, a riff of the classic New York Times slogan. There But for Fortune, then, could qualify as a bit of an outlier at the time, although during this period he wrote other introspective songs like Changes and When I'm Gone. It wasn't until he left the New York folk scene behind for Los Angeles and a record contract with A&M that his writing drifted from the pointed, this happened and you're going to hear about it stuff, more towards cerebral and complex pieces on human behavior. Phil Oakes never had a top 40 radio hit. This song, however, became one, at least in the UK, when Joan Baez recorded it in 1964. But I digress. As you may have heard, UUCP Worship Associates were given a task this year by Reverend Christine. Find a poem, a song, or some piece of writing, and take a deep dive into its meanings, lessons, and morals. Much like my fellow worship associate, John Palumbo, I picked mine on a whim. I was driving to one of our Saturday morning worship associate meetings and was listening to a live concert Phil Oakes was performing in Vancouver in 1968. The version of There But for Fortune on that album struck me in such a poignant way that I thought it kismet and decided that would be the piece I would choose for this project. So, as a team, we dove in deeply and came out the other end with some interesting thoughts. First, we meet the prison man. Already, we create a sense of separation between you or I. His face is growing pale. He's despondent. We're called to feel sympathy for this person. But so many reasons why. Why did he end up there? We don't know. But rather than blaming the individual, we can think of systemic injustices, poverty, trauma, perhaps addiction, lack of opportunity. So many reasons why a person could end up in that kind of circumstance. Next, we meet a person experiencing homelessness, the hobo. Though now an uncouth term to use to describe our fellow human beings, the term does have some murky etymology. A hobo was a migrant worker, one that worked primarily in fields where they would use a hoe. And beau likely comes from boy. Some also claim it's a portmanteau, if I got that word correctly, of homeward bound. Like the prisoner, this person is defined by just one characteristic. But shown through a modern lens, we see that this country has never properly tackled the issues that lead someone to homelessness. A lack of affordable housing, a dearth of mental health services. Really, this verse is encouraging listeners to look beyond appearances and recognize that homelessness is rarely caused by one single event. Show me the whiskey stains on the floor. The drunken man stumbles out the door. Opinions on addiction have thankfully shifted in the decades since this song was written. What was once seen as a personal failing now is recognized as a legitimate illness, often spurned by a myriad of other things like depression, anxiety, or PTSD. Phil Oakes himself suffered from alcohol addiction due to the effects of his depression. And once again, the repeated stanza of "so many reasons why" invites us to consider trauma, grief, and other factors that contribute to substance abuse. Now we shift from the individual to the acts of an entire nation. Show me the country where the bombs had to fall. Had is doing a lot of heavy lifting there. Sure, Oakes phrased it that way ironically because bombs, of course, do not fall on their own. Think about who suffers during war, the people being bombed. At the time, the young men getting drafted into doing the bombing and doing the bidding, then returning to their own country suffering from PTSD, discarded by the very nation that sent them off. In fact, one point was made in our discussion that was maybe this whole story is about one person told in reverse. Perhaps the young man, each refrain references, he's drafted into Vietnam. The horrors he experiences there causes deep emotional, physical, and mental unrest. Unable to get the resources he needs, he turns to alcohol. The addiction causes him to lose nearly everything, resulting in homelessness. And we all know how the system treats the unhoused. Eventually, this man is sent off to prison, and he's the prisoner we meet at the beginning of the song. While this may not have been Phil Oakes' intention behind the song, it certainly highlights how multiple hardships can build upon one another rather than exist as isolated problems. And the repeated refrain, "There but for fortune go you or I." It reminds all of us that the difference between you, me, or anyone and the people in this song is more than often luck, opportunity, and circumstance, rather than some kind of moral superiority. Fortune is not just wealth. It's your access to education or health care, the support you receive throughout your life, opportunities available to you. Another word on luck. Luck is being born into generational wealth. And privilege is shielding you from structural inequality in the age of mass incarceration and state-sanctioned enslavement. Shout out to Alex for that line. Thank you. But still, no one is completely separate from these struggles. This song encourages humility and empathy while recognizing that social systems shape many life outcomes. There but for fortune is not without its tension. It is not wholly compassionate or wholly flawed. While Oakes does humanize people who are often stigmatized, he introduces them by labels, which reinforce the categories the song intends to challenge. That tension can make for a richer interpretation when we realize that it was written within the social fabric of the time, while also pushing the audience in the direction of greater empathy. And ultimately, It is empathy, along with humility and shared responsibility, that call us to address the conditions that create such suffering. There's another anecdote that was swirling around in my head as I was preparing this sermon. Comedian Pete Holmes, who actually has a lot of great material on religion and spirituality, highly recommended, was on a podcast recently, and he told the host about a story he would tell on stage. It's not a particularly funny story, but he would tell it anyway. He'd start out asking the crowd if anyone has ever had 2 glasses of wine and then gone for a drive. A majority of the folks in the audience would raise their hands. He then proceeds to tell a true story about a man who had 2 glasses of wine with lunch, and on the drive home, he was T-boned by a person who was completely blackout drunk. This guy's really over the limit. The crash sends 2 Glass Wine Man's car into a construction site and kills a construction worker. And because that wine in his system put him slightly over the legal limit, he goes to jail for 30 years for manslaughter. So much discourse, especially in America, frames prisoners as some kind of other. Criminals, gang members, it's them, it's other. No, it's you. That guy who drank 2 glasses of wine, that's just you on a different day. There but for fortune go you or I.